Ah, the great British weather. We love to moan about it, don't we? A light dusting of snow today and the entire rail network collapses, schools close, and people start panic buying bread like it's the end of days. Puh! But let's wind back the clock. Imagine a time when Britain was actually tough. We just won the Second World War. We were the victors. But we were also, well, we were exhausted, bankrupt, living on rations and dreams. And then nature decided to play the most brutal prank in history. It's January 1947, and, strangely enough, it started beautifully. The first 2 weeks of the year were almost spring-like. On January 15th, folks in North Yorkshire were enjoying a balmy 11 degrees. In Norfolk, it hit 14. People were actually tipping their hats to one another, saying, well, at least the winter's being kind to us after all that war, eh? Oh, how wrong they were. You see, while Britain was relaxing, a massive wall of high pressure was drifting towards Scandinavia. It sat there, like a giant, invisible gatekeeper, blocking the relatively warm air from the Atlantic. And what did it let in instead? Whoosh! The Siberian winds, bitter, dry, soul-crushing air straight from the frozen heart of Russia, sweeping across the North Sea without a single thing to stop it. On January 20th, the first frost bit down, hard. By the 23rd, the sky turned a heavy, bruised grey, and it started. Crinkle. The snow began to fall. Now, here is the bit people often miss. Most history books call this a natural disaster, but if we're being honest, it was a logistics disaster dressed in a white coat. Before the war, Britain kept 10 to 12 weeks of coal stockpiled. In January 47, we had barely 4 weeks' worth. We were a nation running on empty. We had the victory medals on the mantelpiece, but the fireplace was stone cold.
Imagine waking up on the morning of January 24th. You're in a house with no central heating. You pull the covers up to your chin and you see it. Your own breath puffing out in the bedroom like a steam train. You look at the window and you can't see out. Not because of the snow, but because of the ice inside the glass. Thick, crystalline patterns that the kids would try to scrape away with their fingernails just to let a tiny sliver of grey daylight in. Brr. Getting out of bed wasn't just a choice, it was a tactical manoeuvre. You'd have to sleep with your slippers under the duvet just so they wouldn't be frozen blocks of felt when your feet hit the floorboards. But here's the logic flip, the thing most people don't talk about. We often think of the Blitz as Britain's darkest hour, but during the Blitz, you could at least hate the enemy. You could point at the planes. In the winter of 47, the enemy was invisible. It was the air itself. It was the very silence of the snow. It didn't just fall for a day or two. It fell and it fell and it kept falling for 55 days straight. Britain wasn't just cold, Britain was being buried alive. So the snow is piling up, the pipes are bursting, and Britain is shivering. But here's the thing, cold is one thing, but being cold, hungry, and in the dark, that's a whole different level of misery. And for that, the British public had one specific name to curse, Emmanuel Shinwell. Psst. Poor old Manny Shinwell. He was the Minister of Fuel and Power, and let's just say he wasn't exactly a master of the Plan B. Back in October 1946, experts warned him that a coal shortage was coming, but Manny, he gambled. He bet everything on the hope that the winter would be mild. He didn't want to upset the coal miners, and he didn't want to admit that the new Britain was struggling to even keep the lights on. He lost that bet, spectacularly. By early February, the coal wasn't moving. Why? Because 750,000 railway wagons full of the black gold that Britain desperately needed were literally frozen to the tracks. Clink, they couldn't move. Roads were gone, ships were stuck in ice.
On Friday, February 7th, Shinwell stood up in the House of Commons. The room was chilly, but the news was colder. He announced that from Monday, electricity to all industries in London and the Midlands would be cut completely. Just like that, 4 million people were thrown out of work overnight. Factories went silent. The British export engine that was supposed to rebuild the country after the war, it just stalled. And for the ordinary family at home, life became a series of dead hours. You had electricity for 19 hours a day, but from 9 to 12 in the morning and 2 to 4 in the afternoon, the power was killed. No radio, no heating, no light. Imagine it. Shh. The silence of a house with no power. You'd sit in the living room, wearing every jumper you owned, sometimes 2 or 3, wrapped in a moth-eaten blanket, staring at a fireplace that was burning nothing but scraps of old furniture because the coal man hadn't been seen in weeks. Even Buckingham Palace wasn't spared. The King and Queen were wandering through draughty corridors by candlelight. If the royals were freezing, what hope did a family in a terrace house in Manchester have? But the government had a brilliant plan to keep us fed. Enter the Snook. Ugh. Since meat was still rationed and the ground was too frozen to dig up potatoes, the Ministry of Food started a massive campaign to promote this cheap South African fish called snook. They told us it was nutritious. They gave us recipes for snook paste. Let me tell you something, people hated it. It was oily, it smelled like a wet dog, and it tasted like despair. Most of it ended up being fed to the cats, and even the cats looked at it with suspicion. It became a national joke, a symbol of a government that had lost the plot. Now here is the logic flip that most people ignore. We usually blame the weather, right? Oh, it was an act of God. But the real reason 1947 was so devastating wasn't just the snow, it was the exhaustion. Britain was like a marathon runner who had just crossed the finish line of World War II, only to be told they had to run another 20 miles in a blizzard. Our infrastructure was old, our mines were understaffed, and our spirit was thin.
And yet, in the middle of this blackout Britain, something strange happened. People didn't riot, they didn't storm the parliament, they just queued. They queued for Coke, the fuel, not the drink. They queued for bread, and they shared their candles. It was the Blitz spirit without the bombs. But as the snow reached the rooftops of villages in Devon and the north, people began to wonder, when does this end? Because little did they know, the worst was yet to come. The snow was a wall, but when that wall melted, that's when the real disaster would float into their living rooms. If you think a big drift is a bit of snow on your driveway, think again. In the winter of 47, the snow didn't just lie there, it moved. Driven by those relentless Siberian winds, the snow formed drifts that were, gasp, up to 7 meters high. That's over 20 feet. We're talking about entire cottages, telegraph poles, and steam locomotives just vanishing. Imagine being a farmer in the Denbighshire Hills. You wake up, you try to open your front door, and you can't. You're looking at a solid wall of ice. You have to climb out of your second-story window just to see the world. Hundreds of villages became literal islands in a sea of white. No post, no milk, no news. The military had to step in. It was the largest peacetime operation Britain had ever seen. We had Polish troops, British soldiers, and even German prisoners of war, who were still in the country, working side by side, digging out the railways by hand. Scrape, thud, 100,000 men with shovels against an entire winter. And then there was Operation Black Currant. This is the bit I love because it's so mad scientist British. Since the power stations had no coal, the Royal Navy sent submarines into coastal towns. They plugged the sub's diesel generators into the local grid to keep the lights on. The crews lived in those boats for weeks, freezing their socks off because the engines sucked all the warm air out, just so a few more houses could have a bit of heat. Talk about a stiff upper lip. But here is the logic flip, the part that's truly heartbreaking. We always think of snow as pretty or fun for kids, and for a while it was. My own granddad told me about using a tea tray as a sledge and feeling like a king. But for the farmers, it was a massacre.
When you see the stat, 2 million sheep and 30,000 cattle lost, it's just a number. But imagine being a farmer, digging through a drift with your bare hands, hoping to find your flock, only to find they'd frozen solid where they stood. They couldn't even harvest the vegetables because the ground was like concrete. They had to use heavy machinery just to mine potatoes out of the earth. Then March 4th arrived. Drip, drop. The wind shifted, the sun came out, everyone cheered. Finally, they thought, the nightmare is over. Wrong. It was just the beginning of the second act. You see, the ground was still frozen rock hard. When that massive volume of snow melted, the water had nowhere to go. It couldn't soak into the soil, so it ran. It surged into the Thames, the Trent, the Severn. On March 10th, the rain started. Patter, patter, splash. It was a catastrophe. Over 100,000 properties were drowned. In places like Maidenhead and Windsor, people who had survived 2 months of freezing were now watching their furniture float out the front door. The damage was over £12 billion in today's money. So, what's the lesson here? Most people say 1947 was the winter that nearly broke us, but I think it's the winter that changed us. It destroyed the public's blind trust in the government. It showed that victory in war doesn't mean safety at home. It was the moment the British public realized that the world had changed and the old ways of muddling through weren't going to cut it anymore. But tell me, do you have a story from your family? Did your nan mention the big freeze or that legendary terrible Snook fish? Drop a comment below. I want to hear the real stories, the ones the history books leave out. And if you want to keep these memories alive, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button. Let's make sure the victory generation is never forgotten, even if they were a bit soggy and very, very cold. Stay warm, and I'll see you in the next one. Cheers.